In somewhat nervously preparing to make this talk, I was thinking about what stance or tone to adopt. I want to try and address three questions. What's Canada doing there? Why is it doing it? And what can be done about it? Early last year, John Manley, who now, by the way, is the President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Corporate Executives, Chief Executives, was given the job by Stephen Harper to make a report on Canada's mission in Afghanistan. And he did so, I think, in January of 2008. And the report emphasized Canada's role in terms of the three Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. This is what we are said to be doing there. Well, let's just consider those three Ds in the light of the last 8 years of our presence in Afghanistan as part of the NATO mission led by the United States without, in the beginning, proper UN sanction. In terms of defense, what have we accomplished? The number of casualties of killed and wounded, whether of soldiers or of civilians, has increased steadily year by year until the present, occasioning distraught statements from various officials in high places about losing this battle. Moreover, the enemy that we're fighting, the Taliban, are they weaker for our efforts? In fact, no. We have managed to strengthen them by enabling them to recruit more of the citizens of Afghanistan who quite naturally take exception to having their wedding parties blown up by drone planes that from bombs that appear out of the sky from nowhere, or take exception to having their homes broken into at night by soldiers. These are fine recruiting strategies for the enemy. What about diplomacy? This effectively has meant that Canada has supposed to strengthen the capacity of the central government in Afghanistan to rule the country. Well, has it done that? We've just had elections in Afghanistan, and the embarrassment all over the faces of officials there is striking because of the extraordinary amount of fraud perpetrated, it appears, by the leading candidate, the president of the country, Hamid Karzai. And so a runoff election is now required between the two leading candidates, since the first set of figures were too unreliable to use, or at least didn't give a majority once recounted to Mr. Karzai. And it's worth just remembering who those two people are. Mr. Abdullah. Abdullah is one of those Northern Alliance warlords from the 1990s whose brutality was noted at the time. Mr. Karzai has been on the payroll of the CIA in his time. How about development? Surely we have brought better living conditions and a standard of living for the people of Afghanistan. Well, I just read in the Globe and Mail this week just a short story about how Afghanistan now produces 92% of the world's opium, 2/3 of it being refined into heroin before it leaves the country. This is standardly used as a measure of how well the Afghanistan economy is doing, and if farmers are producing opium in huge amounts, it's because the economy is otherwise ruined. Instead of those three Ds, I suggest that we think about Canada's role in Afghanistan as producing another three Ds: death, deceit, and devastation. Deceit, I've talked about death, I've talked about devastation. Deceit is a matter of the amount of lying that has been carried out by the Canadian government to the Canadian people about what we're really doing there. So what are we really doing there? Why are we there? This was revealed rather nicely in a recent book by Janice Gross-Stein and Eugene Lang, by no means controversial authors, well establishment figures in Canadian academia, in their book The Unexpected War, in which they reveal that our military could not contain itself at the prospect of joining up with the Americans, with the big boys, in order to have a nice big fight somewhere in the world. That occasioned by the fact that the Americans wanted us to do the heavy lifting in Afghanistan, given that we're not going to do it in Iraq. And so there was a sort of a deal struck in Washington. John McCallum, this defense secretary, went down, talked to Rumsfeld and others, and the understanding was struck. You needn't go to Iraq, said Rumsfeld, just do the heavy work in Afghanistan. And of course we couldn't contain ourselves with the thought of being of use to the Americans. The second reason, the lesser reason, is that the Canadian government largely serves the interests of Canada's corporations, and there are considerable resources that are at stake in Afghanistan to do with oil and gas and the mining of minerals. Notably the pipeline, the TAPI pipeline that runs from Turkmenistan, is intended to run from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, carrying gas to Pakistan and India, runs right through Kandahar, the very place that Canadians have been defending, the intended route. So none of this has been talked about in the Canadian press, the Canadian media. In fact, when John Foster, who did the study of the pipeline politics involved, and which came out in July of 2008 on the website of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, made his report, it was actually reported in a banner headline in the Globe and Mail the following day, only to disappear from the news and never be discussed since. It's like it was some sacred law was broken, that we should think that such crass economic interests were actually involved in this play. He points out that the great energy game that the United States is playing is what Afghanistan is all about. Thirdly then, what should we do about this? Well, if we were in the Canadian government, I would suggest that we immediately broker a ceasefire in Afghanistan and then negotiate a withdrawal. There's a simple principle involved here, and that's the one that's enunciated in the United Nations Charter and is commonsensical in its form, and that is that the fundamental principle of all relationships, whether between people or nations, is the right of self-determination, the right that people have to determine their own lives. We have no business being in Afghanistan, and we should get out. We have important work to do here. Christy Blatchford, God bless her, has pointed out that the conditions on the reserves of First Nations approximate those that the average person lives in Afghanistan. Surely there's plenty of work, development work, to be done here at home. And as for us, what might we be doing? For those who oppose this war, which, by the way, is a case of the supreme crime, an invasion and occupation that had no legal basis in the United Nations Charter, and thus is a case of the kind of crime for which the Nazis were hung at Nuremberg. We should resist, resist, and resist.